Hi, everyone, and welcome to Sagentia Innovation's latest webinar. The future of breast cancer screening will be taking a patient-centric approach to innovation. I'm Kate Marchio, Director of Medical Business Development for Sagentia Innovation, and I'll be your host for today. Just a couple quick things to point out before we begin. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions, so please go ahead and submit those at any time throughout the presentation. You may do so in the chat section of the control panel. You can also submit any technical issues that you're having in the same area, and we'll be sure to address those for you right away. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our presenter today, Erica Cantor. As the head of women's health for Sagentia Innovation, Erica's mission is to help companies design breakthrough solutions that will change the future of healthcare. She's particularly passionate about improving patient outcomes through holistic, user-centered design across a full spectrum of women's health and fertility journey. So with that, I am pleased to present Erica. Erica, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kate. Today we will be talking about the future of breast cancer screening and very much that patient-centric approach to invention. My name is Erica Cantor. I'm head of women's health at Sagentia Innovation. And as Kate mentioned, I'm extremely passionate about pushing the agenda forward for women's health. And in our webinar today, here's a brief look at the agenda. We're going to start by talking about the current state of global breast cancer screening and the different types of screening programs that exist. We'll give an overview of our research into the unmet patient and clinician needs. And we'll talk through some of the exciting opportunities as we see them for innovation in this space and where we see the disruptive technologies of the future. We'll spend about 35 minutes going through our thoughts, and there should be about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So do feel free to submit your questions, and we will get to them towards the end. So we have been undergoing an independent investigation into breast cancer screening here at Sagentia. This process has very much mirrored what we do for clients quite often on projects. But we've been running it independently as it's a space that's extremely important to us as a business and a space that we see as ripe for innovation. The first step in this was to gather stakeholder insights. So we combined secondary research with primary research to explore the industry trends, stakeholder pain points, and use case scenarios. Our primary research involved interviews with clinicians and experts in the field, as well as women who had actually undergone breast cancer screening in countries like the UK, the US, Germany, and South Korea, really to understand their journeys, their experience, and empathize with where the pain points might be for them in the process. This then allowed us to synthesize a set of unmet needs. The second step in the process was a technology landscape. So identifying the existing technologies, so the current standard of care, as well as the emerging and disruptive technologies in the space. And we then mapped those against the unmet needs. This allowed us to identify the most critical white space opportunities and where there might be room for new products and services. And those white space opportunities were then the major topics for our ideation sessions. So this followed a tried and tested method that we use on many client projects of divergent convergent ideation. And we held a series of these with our internal experts across our business, our clever engineers and scientists, to come up with novel concepts for each of the spaces that we'd identified. So this is an ongoing process for us, and we'll talk you through some of our findings and where we're seeing the most opportunity. And it's a space we're going to continue to explore in the coming months and hopefully years. So a brief introduction to breast cancer. In 2020, there were nearly 20 million new cases of cancer diagnosed, and of those, 11.7% were breast cancer. So it was the most prevalent cancer new incidence in 2020. and that's across both men and women. For just the female population, breast cancer represented nearly a quarter of new cases in 2020, showing really that it is a major disease and still a major concern globally, and requires quite a tailored and targeted approach, and new solutions will help to hopefully reduce this incident and improve outcomes. So a quick look at the breast cancer care continuum. So today we're going to be focused on the screening portion of this, but of course it's part of a larger care pathway. The prevention space itself is becoming more and more interesting as we better understand how lifestyle factors impact our risk of getting cancers like breast cancer. And there's emerging evidence around health and well-being and things like diet and exercise and how those can affect our risk. And of course, the screening process feeds into the rest of the care continuum, from diagnosis to treatment to monitoring. And there's a number of new innovations in each of these fields, but we'll be focusing on screening today. Some of the major trends and drivers in breast cancer include the aging population, which is partially leading to that increase in breast cancer incidence. Some emerging technologies like imaging and automation, artificial intelligence are starting to change the game and allowing us to catch cancer early and treat cancer more effectively. There's also interesting new technologies like genetic testing that are starting to become more accessible to the global population and changing how we predict the risk of cancer. Precision medicine is helping to lead to the de-escalation of therapy. Part of the challenge with being able to diagnose and identify cancer earlier is it can lead to overtreatment and treating cancers that were low risk in terms of lifetime risk. And so there's a need for a de-escalation of therapy and very much targeting our treatments to those who need it. And all of this is allowing us to actually manage cancer and breast cancer as a chronic disease, as opposed to an acute condition. So early detection remains the cornerstone of breast cancer control, helping us to improve outcomes and improve survival rates. And screening programs differ from country to country. In some countries like the US, it's mostly based on self-referral. So the first time a patient goes for their breast cancer screening, it's likely because they've referred themselves or have been referred by a doctor, and there's no population level screening program. Screening can start anywhere from age 40, but typically from 50 onwards in the States, and tends to occur every 1 to 2 years. The standard of care in the US is mammography, and it has quite a high uptake at the moment. In the UK, we have the National Health Service, which has a population level screening program. So from the age of 50, you're invited for your breast cancer screening every 3 years or so. And again, mammography is the standard of care. In China, they've trialed different programs, but it remains mostly through self-referral and private care, and tends to be, again, from the age 40 or 50 onwards every couple of years. But uptake is quite significantly lower in China, largely due to the lack of awareness and education provided by the government around the importance of screening in reducing breast cancer risk and improving outcomes. So, of course, we've been experiencing the COVID-19 pandemic for the last couple of years, and that's had a huge impact on cancer care globally. In the US, for instance, the pandemic resulted in an initial 94% drop in breast cancer screenings. And due to these delayed or missed screenings, we predict that cancer cases could be diagnosed at a later stage, which can lead to a poorer prognosis. So what this really highlights is the need for alternative screening methods, more accessible, readily available screening methods to allow us to catch up on that backlog and screen the entire population more effectively, I think we won't know the true impact of the pandemic on cancer outcomes for many years to come, but hopefully we're starting to catch up, and new technologies are allowing us to do that. So we're going to have a quick look at a comparison of breast cancer screening methods. Mammography, of course, is the most common and widely practiced breast cancer screening modality. It uses visualization of the breast tissue through low-dose X-rays. The breast self-exam is often talked about, but it isn't often implemented effectively, largely because women don't always know how to do it effectively or forget to perform it on a regular basis. And so there's mixed clinical data around the real effectiveness of breast self-exams. But often women find lumps themselves, and that can lead to their first screening if it's before national programs for screening. The clinical breast exam is similar, and there are variations from clinic to clinic and clinician to clinician, but it can be helpful in monitoring between screenings if you're at a higher risk. Ultrasound is emerging as a new technique, a new modality for screening for breast cancer. It uses sound waves to develop a detailed picture of the breast tissue. And it's often recommended for younger women or for women with dense breast tissue because it can be more effective than mammography for dense breasts, but also because there is no ionizing radiation, which is a risk with mammography. MRI is a well-known technique that's also used and often as an adjunct to mammography. It uses radio waves and strong magnets to develop a detailed picture of the breast tissue. And it's typically used as a diagnostic tool or for high-risk patients for regular screenings. Digital breast tomosynthesis or digital mammography is an emerging field and combines thin cross-sectional images with conventional X-rays to build up a 3D image of the breast. And this was approved by the FDA in 2011 for breast cancer screening and is seen as more accurate and more effective than traditional mammography. And finally, gene detection. So women with mutations in the BRCA1 and 2 genes have a 50 to 80% risk of developing breast cancer. And so if you can screen for those women who have the genes, you're more likely to be able to implement more effective risk stratification and screening programs for those women at high risk. Of course, genetic testing isn't widely available yet. In the UK, it's only available, for instance, if a relative has a positive test for a BRCA1 or 2 mutation. But I think we'll start to see that becoming more and more utilized as it becomes more widely available. So each of these methods has their limitations. We'll be focusing largely on mammography today because it is the standard of care. Some of the challenges with mammography are, again, as mentioned, the risk of radiation. It is low dose, but it does exist, and there's that risk of exposure that means that it tends not to be used for younger populations, as it's not, the risk benefit isn't worth it at that stage. Some of the other challenges are with false negatives. So when cancer is there but is not detected, and false positives where they find something on the mammogram, it leads to further diagnostics or further treatment, but in fact, there wasn't actually cancer. And so both of those add burden to the healthcare system, and both can also lead to anxiety and stress for patients if they need to undergo further treatment that they don't need, or if their cancer is diagnosed later than it could have been because the mammogram wasn't as accurate as it should have been. And so particularly for women with dense breasts, that accuracy is a real challenge, and we're needing new solutions or perhaps a shift in mindset around some of the other modalities like ultrasound in terms of what the standard of care should be moving forward. So a quick look at some of the results and insights that we received through our investigation. So this is a summary of some of the findings we gathered through our interviews with women who had undergone breast cancer screening. And we found that there were a number of factors that actually discourage women from attending screenings. And these tend to be mostly around the discomfort of mammograms. Often talked about are the cold plates, compression plates, and the pressure and discomfort and sometimes pain from the compression of the breast tissue that's required for mammography. And so there's some of those practical physical concerns that discourage women. Radiation is also a concern for those who are aware of it, but it's often not talked about, and so isn't often as high a concern. And there's also some anxiety and fear, particularly when waiting for results. If there are things that are found on the mammogram that need following up, the time between testings can increase that anxiety for women. But what was interesting in all of these conversations is that despite these concerns, despite these potential drawbacks of the process, most women understood the importance of going for their regular screenings. And we think this is largely due to the fact that it is so prevalent. Most of us know someone or know someone who knows someone who has had breast cancer. Most of us have a connection to the disease. And so we understand that it's critical to go for our screenings, to take control of our own health, and reduce our own risk in the process. So we also talked with clinicians about the process of performing a mammogram, as well as a clinical breast exam, and some of the challenges that they face in the clinical pathway. A lot of these are practical challenges, for instance, with women with dense breast tissue where mammography isn't as effective. It can be challenging to read the image and then refer to a separate modality, often MRI. The positioning of the breast is a challenge, as well as optimizing the breast compression, because there's a balance between the patient discomfort and the quality of the image. So the more compressed you can get the tissue, the more accurate and consistent the imaging will be, but of course the less comfortable it will be for the patient. So there's always a balance to be struck there, including with the radiation dose versus image quality output. So a number of interesting considerations and challenges. There's also some challenge around clinical breast exams and reliance on experience, because it can be quite a subjective exercise. And so there's a need for more standardization in that area as well. So from all of these interviews, we synthesized some of the anecdotal notes and requests and concerns that came out. Things like the mammograms being uncomfortable, apprehension around the pain of screening, frustration at being dismissed if they were seen as too young to go for screening was quite an interesting one. And for clinicians, challenges with the 40% of women who have dense breasts and not having a real solution to offer them at the moment. And some of the challenges with retrieving information around risk factors, and the lack of available genetic testing to help risk stratify. And so from all of these conversations and all of these insights, we extracted a set of very high level requirements for when you're designing any new next generation screening solution. So these need to be considered to ensure the new solution meets these unmet needs. So for the patient, it's very much around the safety, the comfort, the speed of test results to reduce anxiety, and ideally reducing the frequency of screening for those low-risk populations. And for clinicians, it's around the ease of use, how easy it is to interpret the results, and reducing some of that ionizing radiation if possible is seen as a benefit for new technologies. But some of the most important ones in clinic are the throughput. So the more quickly you can run a screen, the more women you can get through in a day, and the more population you can screen to ensure their safety. As mentioned, there was a backlog, and that backlog has increased with the pandemic, so that throughput is absolutely critical. It also needs to be cost effective, of course, and ideally increase the accuracy and specificity of the imaging. So from all of this, as mentioned, we then fed our data into a series of ideation sessions, and these focused on 4 specific areas across the care continuum for breast cancer screening. So for triaging, it was clearly recognized through our conversations that there was a need for a cost-effective technology that could accurately quantify breast density. So this doesn't exist at the moment. Breast density is measured from a mammogram, and it's quite a subjective measurement. For risk stratification, there's a clear need for better systems that are integrated and automated and easy to use so that some of these population level one-size-fits-all programs can be tailored to individuals. For screening itself, I think it was considered quite critical that an alternative to mammography was developed, something that was comfortable, affordable, and importantly accurate for the entire population. And so this is one of the areas that we focused on in our ideation. And monitoring. So beyond the once yearly, every 2 years, 3 years screenings, there's a need for better monitoring of patients who are at higher risk, or indeed an ability to do screenings prior to your mammograms or whatever the standard of care is in the future. And so having something that could be a regular longitudinal system that could be implemented was seen as quite an interesting space to explore. So for triaging, for dense breasts, so 40% of women, as mentioned, have dense breast tissue. And women with dense breasts have a higher risk of developing breast cancer in the first place. And standard mammography becomes less accurate with increased tissue density. So not only do we need better screening systems other than mammography, but we also need a way of identifying those women, those 40% of women who have dense breasts in the first place. So our question was, could a system be developed to measure breast density at the point of care? And we looked specifically at a number of modalities, but microwave imaging emerged as quite an interesting one. So just a bit more context. Breast density is defined as the relative proportion of fibroglandular to fatty tissue in the breast. And it's currently classified by a radiologist. So they perform a visual assessment of the mammogram and categorize the breast density into 4 specific categories. One is shown here, category D, which is extremely dense. So this can be quite a subjective measurement, and it does require a mammogram in the first place in order to get that assessment. So we believed what was needed was something that could be used in a GP's office, for instance, prior to your regular screenings, to better risk stratify women really and put them down a care pathway that's most appropriate for their personal history and physical characteristics. So in terms of technology readiness, microwave imaging is a viable technology that's capable of measuring breast density. It is being explored by researchers at the moment as a low-cost solution. Some of the challenge with it lies in the computational aspects. So it often needs to be coupled with machine learning in order to assess the image and determine different things like density. And also the coupling between the sensors and the skin. So similar to ultrasound, microwave imaging requires an airless coupling. So often that means a gel or a water coupling between the sensors and the skin, which make the device more complex. And so alongside microwave, we also looked at ultrasound and MRI, which both have possibilities for measuring breast density. And it could be a handheld device, it could be a standalone device that could sit in a GP's office, or perhaps even an at-home device that could be used in the comfort of your home to measure breast density in your early 20s, for instance, to better understand what care pathway would suit you best. For exploring the need for better risk stratification systems, As mentioned, population level screening programs tend to be one size fits all. And this is partially due to the fact that a large number of factors have been found to be important to determining the risk of breast cancer. Unlike lung cancer, for instance, where whether you smoke or not is the biggest determinant, for breast cancer, it can be anything from your age, your weight, your personal health history, your reproductive history, genetic mutations, family history, and the list goes on. So there's no systematic process at the moment that exists to aggregate this data and identify those groups who are at higher risk. So our question then was, could an automated system, perhaps a machine learning system, be developed to improve risk stratification and allow us to better allocate our healthcare resources? So an example of a strategy for this could combine personal health data, which exists in your healthcare record, with family health data, which is slightly more complex to integrate due to permissions and access to familial data. At the moment, this is done usually by memory or by rote. When you're sat in the doctor's office trying to remember which relative had certain conditions and manually recording that with your GP. Genetic test results should feed into this, and as genetic testing becomes more widespread, this will be easier to do. And of course, as mentioned, if there could be a more accurate breast density score that could be achieved or gathered prior to this, then that should feed into your overall risk score for breast cancer. So it would be interesting then is to see what do we do with this data and how do we develop a system that allows us to then put people down different care pathways that are most appropriate to them personally. And you know, this is one example of how that could be structured, and there are a number of other ways of doing this, of course. But for low risk populations, perhaps screening starts later and mammograms are sufficient. For those at higher risk who have dense breasts, perhaps it's a yearly MRI with interval screening of some sort. And so these are the types of personalized systems that could be implemented if we had a way of aggregating this kind of patient data. And that's the biggest hurdle to overcome at the moment. As anyone who's worked in the digital health and data field know, the big challenge is around accessing the right data in the right way and the interoperability between healthcare systems. So that's the biggest hurdle to overcome, but hopefully as these systems progress, these types of risk stratification tools would become easier to implement. When we looked at an alternative to mammography, we looked at a huge number of different technologies, some of which we've talked about already, but the main thing is wanting to address the limitations of mammography. So the discomfort of needing the breast compression to get an accurate image, the radiation exposure, the lack of specificity, and the lack of accuracy for women with dense breasts. So our question was, could a device be developed that could replace mammography? And we looked specifically at low field MRI. So typical MRI machines operate at magnetic field strengths of 1.5 to 3 Tesla. The use of such a strong magnetic field requires high resource consumption. So the infrastructure for a large cooling system, 3 separate rooms in a hospital to ensure the machine can be operated safely, and very high energy consumption. MRI machines have been developed to screen the entire body, and so are quite large and cumbersome as systems. The use of low field MRI starts to open up some possibilities, and this is an emerging field of research, and we're starting to see interesting results come out from low field MRI, which allow for low cost, reduced footprint MRI based imaging systems. So some recent research that we found used low field MRI as a brain scanner, as you can see here, and you could see extrapolating that out to breast screening as well. What's interesting about this is that MRI has already been proven as a method for breast cancer screening, and if it could be made portable and accessible, this could be used at the point of care or as a replacement for mammography. The cost of the device would need to be considered, and there may be other limitations to developing this into a feasible technology, but these are all things to be explored. And we looked at a few different embodiments, mostly focused around making sure that the system would be comfortable, as well as being affordable and accurate. And finally, we explored a method for regular longitudinal monitoring, particularly for high-risk patients. So screening programs often miss early and interval cancers. So due to the fact that they tend to start around the age of 40 or 50, if cancer develops in your 20s or 30s, it's likely to progress much further before it's caught at your first screening or from a self-exam. Interval cancers can also occur between screenings, especially if it's an aggressive cancer. And due to the ionizing radiation and the cost as well, mammography hasn't been suitable for younger populations or for more frequent screening. And so could something else be developed? And what we looked at specifically was at-home testing and liquid biopsy as a potential interesting system to develop. Liquid biopsy detects the circulating tumor DNA in the blood and offers a potential for early detection of cancers, perhaps even before they could be imaged in something like a mammogram. One of the challenges with liquid biopsy at the moment is for early cancers, there's a very low concentration of tumor DNA in the blood, and so the system, the diagnostic, would require quite high sensitivity. So it's an emerging method. I think we're a number of years away from having this be accessible to the general population, and it's still at an early research stage for early detection of cancer. But as it becomes more feasible as a technology, one of the biggest challenges is obtaining a blood sample of sufficient volume for the genetic testing. And so what we looked at was, could menstrual blood provide a convenient source of blood in sufficient volumes to perform sequencing? And it's quite an interesting one to consider. Menstrual blood hasn't been very well researched as a source, but of course, on a regular basis as women, we provide a natural biopsy when we menstruate. And so it'd be very interesting to explore the different applications for this. And due to the frequent nature, it could allow for that easy, non-invasive longitudinal tracking and allow us perhaps even to analyze the evolution of mutations over time. So sample collection for this could be performed at home, perhaps with something like a smart tampon or a smart pad that would collect the sample that you could then send into a lab for analysis. There are some companies already starting to look at this space. NextGen Jane are looking at it for other types of diagnostics. Qvin is designing a pad to collect samples as well. And there's a myriad of other applications beyond breast cancer where this could be quite an interesting technology. So in summary, we see different interesting spaces along the care continuum where innovation could have a real impact on outcomes, on patient experience, and on the commercial success for startups and big companies looking to play in the breast cancer screening market. And that's all we have for you today. Thank you very much for joining us. We're really excited about the direction this market is going. We're going to continue our own research into the space and look to explore new technologies and develop the ones that we've discussed here further to look at the technical feasibility of the concepts that we've started to explore. But we'd love to continue the discussion with you. If you have any questions, I look forward to answering them. And thank you very much again for joining us today.
Thank you, Erica. Really appreciate your insights. I'm sure everyone here can agree it's such an important topic in women's health and really apparent how much opportunity there is for innovation and really a lot of new technologies to improve the standard of care and ultimately, as you mentioned, really be great to become more predictive and ultimately preventative. So thank you to everyone who submitted a question. We got a lot of questions, so thank you for that. We're now going to begin the Q&A section of the webinar. And please note it's not too late. If you haven't yet submitted a question, you can still do so in the chat section of the control panel. So we're going to go ahead and go to our first question. All right, so Erica, there's so many technologies trying to tackle breast imaging, including some that are safer and more effective than mammography. So why are some of these technologies not being used more widely? And what is the biggest barrier to innovation in this space?
Yeah, interesting. And it's one of the questions we certainly looked at, particularly as a lot of the limitations of mammography were highlighted through our research. And I think one of the biggest challenges isn't a technical one, it's a commercial one. Most of our clinical data and our history in breast cancer screening, our clinical trials have all been run with mammography. So that's where the burden of proof lies. And so trying to disrupt that is challenging, and there's a lot of big players in the space who have their have their teeth sunk in and they have their piece of the pie, and disrupting that will be a challenge for new entrants. I think what's needed from a new technology is to not only be more accurate, or at least as accurate as mammography, but to provide other benefits to all of the stakeholders involved. So for the radiologist or the GP, it's the accuracy or the throughput that needs to be addressed. For patients, it's the comfort and the speed. And for hospitals and systems, it's the cost. And so if all of those can be addressed and improvements made upon the current standard of care, there's a chance. But mammography is there because it works. It's worked and has worked, but we're finding that it doesn't work as well for portions of our population. So we do need alternative solutions.
Very interesting. And going to the next question, can you talk a little bit about how artificial intelligence is currently impacting the space?
Yeah, it is. And we talked a little bit about how it could be used for risk stratification, for instance, but it's being used more and more widely to help interpret the imaging that comes out from breast screening. Radiologists are in high demand, and it's a highly technical position, and so supporting them in processing the images and identifying potential cancers is one of the main applications for AI in breast cancer screening. It's going to become, I think, even more important as our imaging becomes more complex. As we've seen with digital mammography, you don't just have 2D slices anymore, you have 3D images to analyze, and that just takes even longer to process for a radiologist. And so to improve our throughput, systems that can support that are absolutely critical. So we'll see more and more applications for AI. I think the challenge is still improving the efficacy of it from a healthcare perspective and a regulatory perspective.
Certainly. So going to our next question, this is an interesting one. How evolved are wearables to detect cancer earlier?
I think there's maybe two perspectives on this. There's wearables in the prevention space, in the prevention part of the care continuum. Lifestyle factors have been proven to be huge risk factors for breast cancer and other cancers as well. So more and more trackers and wearables like the Apple Watch and Fitbit are exploring ways of supporting patients and moving into the healthcare realm and providing more sort of predictive recommendations on how to improve your health, whether it's diet or exercise, and reduce your risk of certain conditions. And so there's lots of movement happening in that on that side of the wearables market. But we've also seen some interesting emerging technologies specifically in the screening part of breast cancer screening. Nothing that it could replace mammography as of yet, but certainly supporting mammography and screening for or monitoring breast health in the home. And there's some interesting solutions out there using thermography and other systems, other technologies. One of the challenges with those is in both the accuracy and in the data and how it's handled. I think one of the things that came out from our interviews with patients was that actually they preferred to have a GP or a healthcare professional in the loop. Getting random results, random data is more likely to cause additional stress and anxiety for patients if they're not able to interpret it, if they don't have that context. And so that's the risk with at-home devices, especially ones that aren't part of the current clinical pathway, is that the information provided either won't be valuable enough to provide a diagnostic, or it'll be interesting and valuable but also add to the stress and anxiety for patients. So that needs to be thought through carefully, and different data models can be explored in terms of how that data is communicated and how it fits with our healthcare systems.
Very interesting, and yeah, super important not to give patients data that might inadvertently frighten them or not knowing what to do. So going to the next question, how can the cost of BRCA gene detection be reduced to allow for more widespread adoption?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a good question across the board for genetic testing, and that's where a lot of effort is being placed at the moment, and how you can reduce the cost. We're seeing more and more providers like 23andMe who have direct-to-consumer options for screening for certain genes. In terms of the cost itself, I think if we look at the health economics of it, actually uh, being able to screen the entire population for BRCA1 and 2 genes specifically, but any genetic markers for cancer, could drastically reduce overall healthcare costs, even at the current rate for genetic testing. Because if you can find those populations that are going to develop cancer, you can be preventative in terms of your treatment and reduce treatment costs down the line. So it's more around thinking about it differently and implementing it in our global population systems.
And is the data on patient risk factors sufficiently available for a machine learning risk stratification strategy?
Interesting. Yeah. So this was part of the challenge when we were looking at risk stratification models. Is it all relies on access to data, and access to the right data, and patient-specific data. So the data exists, it's there, it's in your healthcare records, but applying machine learning models to that is not straightforward. I think a lot of the tools that are used now for risk stratification tend to be quite manual tools where you're inputting specific patient data and family history data, and that gives you a score on the risk model. That needs to be automated, but that means having access to the right data. And so we're still a bit behind on that, I think, and a lot of people are trying to solve that issue in the digital space, in the digital health space. And again, as I mentioned before, I think it's around the interoperability of our systems, and permissions being a big challenge in terms of access to the right data.
Great. So we've got time for a few more questions here. So Erica, is technology being developed that looks at both efficacy as well as patient comfort?
Yeah, we've seen a few. I've seen a few interesting solutions recently that could be competitors to mammography, that are looking to address both the question of efficacy and accuracy, but also the question of comfort. And so some are using ultrasound, some are using CT scans, for instance. Some of the interesting ones I've seen involve more of a prone bed that the patient lies down on, allowing the breast to separate from the body and be immersed in a scanning system, which also gives you access to more of the tissue. Often mammography misses some of the tissue into the armpit area, but this can address that as well. And so these systems are being developed. Some of the challenges are around the processing of the imaging itself, which is 3D and more complex, and involves algorithms and other clever systems. But the main goal of these is the comfort of the patient and allowing the scan to happen without the breast compression.
This question slightly related. Can you talk about with mammography, which, as you stated, is majority of the available testing, how do we screen closer to the chest wall?
Mm. I think with that, the challenge comes down again to a question of compression. So the more compressed you can get the tissue close to the wall, the better the imaging is for mammography. So that is the way currently with mammography to improve the imaging close to the wall, is to compress the tissue further, which increases the discomfort for patients. So again, the solution is counterintuitive in terms of the patient-centric approach to invention. And so it's not actually about making, I think we need to look beyond mammography, and that's one of the reasons, is more accurate mammography invariably means less comfort for our women. So it's an interesting question, and that's where other solutions like ultrasound are starting to show more promise.
Excellent. So we're going to go to our last question. This is a good question here. Can you talk about what is the most cost-effective way to screen dense breasts?
Yeah, so this was part of what we looked at in our research, and its cost effectiveness is one of the challenges. And again, sort of comfort and accuracy and accessibility are all the other considerations that we looked at for measuring breast density. Because at the moment, it's during a mammogram that a radiologist will give you a scoring of your density, and so it's quite an expensive way of doing it at the moment, if you were using that purely for breast density measurements. So something more portable and point of care is needed. I think microwave has a lot of possibility. Ultrasound is one that has developed quite a bit in this space and could be used as well, perhaps in conjunction with the screening of the breast for cancer. And so the cost effectiveness comes down to the utility, and down to the technology itself, and how accessible it can be made and how feasible it is to implement some of these newer emerging technologies for this particular application. But yeah, we're excited about the possibilities for all of these modalities in the breast density space.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Erica. Really appreciate all your insights. And in respect to everyone's time, that's all we have for today. So we hope you all have enjoyed the presentation. I realized there's still questions we didn't get a chance to answer. So Erica, or someone from the Sagentia Innovation team, will be sure to follow up with you to make sure you get an answer to your question. Please note, if you'd like to watch the presentation again or share the webinar with your colleagues, we'll be sending you a link, and you may also find it on our website, sagentiainnovation.com. If you'd like more information about any of the topics we've discussed, please be in touch with us at info@sagentiainnovation.com. Soon after the webinar, you'll receive a survey, and we'd appreciate if you complete it and provide us with your feedback. It always helps us to improve and provide meaningful content in the future. For any other information about Sagentia, you can please go ahead and follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter. If you have any questions about product development or innovation challenge that you're focused on, we'd love to hear from you. So on behalf of Sagentia Innovation and our presenter today, Erica Cantor, thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you.